It's May 1775. Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen have just captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British. Fort Ticonderoga is located in northern upstate New York, about an hour and a half drive from Lake Placid. If Lake Placid sounds familiar to you, you probably remember it as the site of the 1980 Winter Olympics with the Miracle on Ice, when the underdog amateur American hockey team beat the Soviets, who had a roster largely consisting of professional athletes. We'll talk more about that later, but in the meantime, by capturing Fort Ticonderoga, the Americans now have possession of the artillery pieces that were positioned there. Well, unfortunately, they're sitting in northern upstate New York, which does no good for the colonial troops in Boston that were being driven off of Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. Well, George Washington, having just been appointed general of the Continental Army, arrives in Boston in June. But when he gets there, he's in shock and disbelief that his army is a complete rabble. The Continental Army lacked most of the things necessary to win a war: health, hygiene, discipline, retention, uniforms, gunpowder, ammunition, and artillery. Well, 2 months after Lexington and Concord, the British are holding Boston under siege, and you need artillery to win siege warfare. Well, unfortunately, Washington's artillery is sitting in northern upstate New York at Fort Ticonderoga. So not only does General Washington have no artillery available, he also has no quality officers, or so he thinks. It's at this point of the story that we meet a man named Henry Knox. Henry Knox is a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston. He's a big, rotund guy. And Knox has no formal education, but as a bookseller, he has no shortage of material to read. And it just so happens that he's fascinated with artillery. Well, in the days before there were tutorial videos on YouTube, Henry Knox learned how to build fortifications and maneuver and fire artillery pieces, all from reading books. Well, in any public setting, it doesn't take very long to identify the chatty Cathy, the social butterfly, the lively, gregarious, flamboyant person. Well, Henry Knox is all of those things. And George Washington is very taken with him. Because you see, Washington realizes that a young, enthusiastic, ambitious go-getter like Henry Knox is exactly what he needs. He needed somebody with a can-do spirit, and boom, he just found him. Well, Knox really wants to be in charge of something. So Washington appoints him to be colonel of the artillery. And Knox says, "Great, where's the artillery?" Washington says, "Well, Henry, I'd love to tell you that Google Maps and the GPS both recommend getting on I-93 North out of Boston, and then taking exit 3 to I-98 North, which will take you straight to Fort Ticonderoga. But who am I kidding? This is 1775. We don't have any of that. So instead, you're going to go this cattywampus way that will end up being about 300 miles. What do you say, champ?" Henry Knox is so full of, well, my daughter's listening, so I'll say pee and vinegar, but you know the actual expression. So he tells General Washington, sure, why not? Washington's War Council is totally against this idea. They think it's ridiculous to send this young 20-something out in the freezing cold to retrieve these artillery pieces. But General Washington says, no, that's what makes him perfect. He's young, he's motivated, he's got a chip on his shoulder. He's so desperate to prove himself. I'm telling you, he won't come back without the artillery. Henry Knox begins his journey on November 17th, 1775. And he told his wife that the whole trip would only last a little more than 2 weeks and that he wouldn't be in any danger. Well, Knox was either naive or lying or perhaps both. Because immediately he hits a winter storm, a nor'easter that almost derails the entire mission. And for a trip that he thought would take a little more than 2 weeks total, it takes him about that long just to get to Fort Ticonderoga. But when he arrives, his team collects 59 pieces of artillery. They take 2 howitzers, 3 mortars, and 44 cannons. The biggest cannon they nickname Old Sow. Old Sow herself weighed more than 5,000 pounds, and she was designed to shoot cannonballs that weighed 24 pounds each. Now, this whole collection of artillery weighed a combined total of 60 tons, or 120,000 pounds, the equivalent of 28 loaded SUVs. Well, to get back to Boston, the first thing they have to do is to get across Lake George, which was no easy task. And Knox is a religious man, and he believes that the fight for American independence is divinely inspired. From our scripture reading today, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17 says, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty." Well, elevating his quest to the likes of the Holy Grail, Knox sends a letter to George Washington saying, "Once we cross the lake, I hope in 16 to 17 days' time to be able to present to your excellency a noble train of artillery." Well, in these weather conditions, wagons won't do Knox any good because the wheels can't go anywhere. So instead, they build sledges and they have oxen drag these artillery pieces over the ice and snow. Now, while most of their journey is across land, their path does require them to cross the Hudson River 4 times as it winds through upstate New York. Well, in that same letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes that we should walk by faith and not by sight. Well, Henry Knox is going to be literally walking by faith because the Hudson River is in various stages of freezing. Some spots are completely frozen over. Some spots are more of a wild card. Well, if the ice breaks, those artillery pieces are going to sink in the river. And not only that, but those pieces are tied with rope to the oxen. So not only will the artillery sink, but the oxen will drown. Well, although he's walking by faith, Knox still wants to be prepared, so he has men carrying axes. And that came in handy because on one of their trips across the river, the ice broke. Well, as the cannon's sinking into the water, Knox's man cuts the rope and saves the oxen, which is great, but they still have the issue of the sunken artillery. Well, I don't think that in 1775, Henry Knox owned any Carrie Underwood albums, but in this moment when the cannon's going down, I wouldn't be surprised if he prayed these words, because we've all been there at some point in life saying, "Jesus, take the wheel. Take it from my hands. I can't do this on my own. I'm letting go. Give me one more chance. Save me from this road I'm on. Jesus, take the wheel." Well, Knox can't afford to lose a single cannon. He knows Washington needs each one. So anything that sank, he and his men have to find a way to retrieve out of the water. And it's now December in northern upstate New York, and these guys are pulling thousands of pounds of cannon out of this freezing cold river. That's how hard these people were willing to work to secure their freedom. Well, they finally get everything across the Hudson River, but their fun isn't over. Next, they have to navigate through the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts. And this is a double whammy because your men and your livestock have the strain of pulling this heavy artillery up the mountain, but then also the dangerous challenge of heading back down the mountain slowly enough that you don't go sliding out of control. This task is so incredibly hard. They're up in the mountains, the air is thin, the temperature is freezing, the need for this artillery is desperate. So Henry Knox wants to rally the troops, so he gives a 3-hour speech. And he tells his men that what we're doing isn't for us. It's for the unborn millions. It's for the people who are yet to come that we're creating this country. What we do here will directly affect them. I mentioned earlier about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team that upset the Soviets in Lake Placid. In the movie Miracle, Kurt Russell plays head coach Herb Brooks. And in the locker room before the big game, he gives this powerful pregame speech to his underdog team. He says, "Great moments are born from great opportunity." And that's what you have here tonight, boys. That's what you've earned here tonight. One game. If we played them 10 times, they might win 9. But not this game. Not tonight. Tonight, we skate with them. Tonight, we stay with them. And we shut them down because we can. Tonight, we are the greatest hockey team in the world. You were born to be hockey players, every one of you, and you were meant to be here tonight. This is your time. Their time is done. It's over. I'm sick and tired of hearing about what a great hockey team the Soviets have. This is your time. Now go out there and take it. Well, if Herb Brooks' speech wasn't powerful enough, as the players are leaving the locker room, we see that the walls by the exit are completely covered with telegrams, each one sending well wishes to the team. And there's this surge of pride as you know the nation is rooting on its team of amateur underdogs against this powerful foe. Well, in the days following Henry Knox's 3-hour speech, he was able to create something similar to those locker room exit vibes. After his men had cleared the Berkshire Mountains, they passed through several small towns in Massachusetts. And most of the folks in these rural communities have never seen huge artillery pieces like this before, so they're completely in awe. And don't forget that Knox has that 5,000-pound cannon he calls Old Sow. Well, as they'd journey from town to town, he'd gather an audience of the locals. He'd point Old Sow's barrel into the mud, and then he'd fire that sucker. Boom! And the crowds went wild. They knew that Old Sow may be firing in the mud today, but she'd be firing at British troops in the near future. Well, the inspirational power of a supportive nation can't be overstated. Well, sitting in Boston, General Washington thinks that perhaps his war council was right. Perhaps his newest colonel has failed. But just then he looks off in the distance and he sees a rider on horseback. Well, darned if it isn't Henry Knox. This 25-year-old bookseller comes riding up and says, "General, I have arrived with your noble train of artillery." Well, it's now January 24th, 1776, and Washington finally has a way to dislodge the British. It's on the south end of town, and there's an area of high ground that overlooks Boston Harbor. It's called Dorchester Heights. And at this point, it's not occupied by either army. And for quite a while, the British commanding officer, General Howe, has been warned that he should take the heights, but he repeatedly disregards this advice. He says, "Don't worry about it. The Americans don't have any artillery. Even if they did take the heights, we'd just take it right back. No big deal." Well, General Howe has made a huge mistake. In fact, he's the first of a number of British officers who will go on to make the same identical mistake as the war progresses. And that is thinking that the Americans are going to fight in the traditional European style. See, traditionally, the Europeans fought their wars in the spring, summer, and fall, and then took winters off for rest and relaxation. Well, surprise, buddy, we aren't playing by those rules. And the thing is, British spies had been saying for weeks now that Henry Knox was on the move with this noble train of artillery, but the powers that be never thought anything of it. The British could have crushed Knox at any point of his 300-mile journey, but they never took their reconnaissance seriously. Well, fast forward to March, General Washington decides that he wants these artillery pieces placed on the top of the high ground of Dorchester Heights. And in order to do this undetected, his men are going to have to move everything all in one night. And the cover of darkness will be helpful, but they also want to erect some type of barrier wall that will muffle the sound of this heavy artillery being maneuvered. But what are they going to use to make a wall? Well, remember that outside of his military career, George Washington was a farmer. He had about 3,000 acres of crops. Most of it was tobacco, but he also grew corn and wheat and a few types of vegetables. And he raised livestock as well. He had horses, beef cattle, dairy cattle, hogs, and sheep. And our image of George Washington today is a man wearing a fancy cravat and a powdered wig. But deep down, he's just a good old country boy. So in order to build this makeshift wall, Washington decides to use an agricultural commodity he knows all too well: hay bales. Now, at least once in your life, many of you have probably participated in a hay ride. And not to spoil the fun, but if you were sitting on something golden yellow, that was not hay. That was straw, and those are two very different things. Straw is a byproduct of the stalks, usually from a wheat field, after the grain and chaff are separated during the harvest. It's golden yellow, it's hollow in the middle, like a drinking straw, and often used for livestock bedding. Hay is a green grass or a legume that you grow and repeatedly cut, and it's used for livestock feed as opposed to bedding. Now, you might not care about the color or the end purpose, but I guarantee that if you've handled these bales before, you do care about the weight. Hay bales are noticeably heavier than straw bales. And I mentioned the distinct heaviness of the hay bales because I want you to have a greater appreciation for the work these men had to do. It's the middle of the night in early March in Boston, Massachusetts, and these guys not only have to stack these hay bales, but then they have to maneuver thousands of pounds of heavy artillery going uphill. Well, on the morning of March 5th, which happens to be the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, General Washington is up on Dorchester Heights and he gives a speech saying, "This is for the future. What we do here will be remembered for all time." Then he gives Knox the signal to open fire. Boom, boom, boom! Meanwhile, the British commanding officer, General Howe, is asleep in Boston with his concubine. Well, these shells start landing all around him. He comes running into the street and looks through his monocular, and he sees all of these cannons that were taken from Fort Ticonderoga that are now firing down on him from Dorchester Heights. And he says, "These fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." And moments later, it dawns on him that these cannons are threatening the British fleet anchored in Boston Harbor. Well, Howe's admiral tells him, "You either wipe those cannons off of Dorchester Heights, or I'm taking my ships and we're getting the heck out of Dodge." Well, General Howe doesn't want his admiral to pull the fleet, so he orders his British cannons to shoot back at Dorchester Heights. But the problem for Howe is that the laws of physics are working against him. The Americans have the high ground, so they can rain shells down on the British. But when the British return fire, they're working against gravity, and their shells don't have the range to hit the American position. Well, General Howe briefly considers launching a direct assault with his infantry, but trying to go uphill against Washington's well-fortified artillery would have been a bloodbath. And when a freak snowstorm hit, General Howe realizes it's time to pack up and go. Well, if on the Hudson River, Henry Knox was singing the chorus of "Jesus Take the Wheel" by Carrie Underwood, then in Boston Harbor, General Howe was singing the chorus of "The Gambler" by Kenny Rogers. You got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em, know when to walk away, and know when to run. Well, Howe sends word to Washington that the British are going to evacuate Boston. And he says, "If you promise to let us leave peacefully, we promise not to torch the city on our way out." Washington agrees, and the British sail away. Well, victory at Dorchester Heights was significant in helping convince other countries that supporting the American Revolution is not a fool's errand. The French in particular start to realize that this is a real fight now, and there's a chance America could win. And this was due in large part to a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox, agreeing to collect 60 tons of heavy artillery, dragging them 300 miles in the dead of winter, riding them across Lake George and the Hudson River, hauling them over the Berkshire Mountains, and in the middle of the night, dragging them up to Dorchester Heights. They survived despite breaks in the ice. They survived despite British reconnaissance reporting their position. They survived despite all the odds. It was truly a miracle on ice. Well, in the closing seconds of regulation of the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team's upset of the Soviet Union, TV broadcaster Al Michaels said, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes. And at every step of Henry Knox's noble train of artillery, the same question could be asked. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. Well, sometimes in life, we feel like Colonel Knox. We're under siege, and we have no allies. The tools we desperately need are hundreds of miles away. The ice is breaking at our feet, and everything around us is sinking. The road ahead is a steep and slippery mountain. We have heavy lifting and sleepless nights. But in those moments, much like Colonel Knox, I pray, Jesus, take the wheel. Take it from my hands. I can't do this on my own. I'm letting go. Give me one more chance. Save me from this road I'm on. Jesus, take the wheel. Folks, I have witnessed the power of prayer, and I've got to tell you that when I decided to let Jesus take the wheel in my life, then if someone asks me, do you believe in miracles? My answer is a resounding yes. So I'll ask you that same question today. Do you believe in miracles? Amen.